He almost didn't hear her. Anthony Hopkins was halfway down the street, coat collar turned up against the evening air, mind elsewhere. The day had been long. Rehearsals that stretched, conversations that repeated themselves, the familiar exhaustion that came from being listened to without always being heard. The street was busy in that muted way cities get just before night settles fully. Cars rolled past. Footsteps echoed. Voices overlapped and dissolved. And then, something cut through it. Not volume. Clarity. A woman's voice, steady and unadorned, carrying words with careful precision. Hopkins slowed. He didn't recognize the melody because there wasn't one. She wasn't singing in the traditional sense. She was performing, reciting lines with rhythm, cadence, breath placed exactly where it belonged. His words. Not a famous line. Not one people quoted. Something obscure. Something written years ago for a role most audiences barely remembered. Hopkins stopped walking. He turned. Across the street, seated on a low stool near the edge of the pavement, was a young woman. Early 20s, maybe younger. Dark glasses. A folded cane resting against her knee. A small sign at her feet, handwritten, uneven. Blind. Performing spoken word. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't drawing attention. She was speaking as if the street itself were her audience. Hopkins crossed without thinking. He stood a few feet away, unnoticed, listening. She didn't rush. She allowed silence between phrases. Trusted it. Let it breathe. It wasn't mimicry. It was understanding. That unsettled him. People often repeated his lines because they sounded clever, or sharp, or dramatic. They performed them outward. She was performing inward. When she finished, there was a pause. No applause. Just the street resuming its noise, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She reached down, adjusted the cane, and began again, another piece. Different words. Same care. Hopkins remained where he was. A few passers-by slowed, listened briefly, then moved on. One dropped a coin without stopping. She didn't react. Hopkins stepped closer. "Excuse me," he said gently. She stopped midline. "Yes?" she replied, turning her head toward his voice. Not directly at him, but close enough to suggest long practice at locating sound. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Hopkins said. She smiled faintly. "You are. But that's all right." He hesitated. "That piece you just performed," he said. "Where did you learn it?" She tilted her head. "From listening." "Yes," Hopkins said. "But originally?" She shrugged lightly. "Films. Radio. Recordings. Sometimes transcripts." "You chose that one deliberately," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. "Because," she said finally, "it doesn't ask for sympathy." Hopkins felt something tighten in his chest. "That's true," he said. She smiled again, a little more this time. "Most people don't notice that." "No," Hopkins agreed. "They don't." He glanced at the sign by her feet. There were only a few coins. "You don't charge," he said. "I don't busk," she corrected. "I perform." "What's the difference?" She turned slightly, as if aligning herself more fully with him. "Busking asks people to look at me," she said. "Performing lets me disappear." Hopkins exhaled slowly. "Do you know who wrote that piece?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I do. And it doesn't matter," she replied. "The words belong to whoever needs them." Hopkins was quiet. "May I ask your name?" he said. "Clara," she replied. "Anthony," he said. She nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." There was no flicker of recognition. He found that strangely relieving. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Here," she said. "A few months." "Altogether?" "Years." "And before that?" She shifted on the stool. "Before that," she said, "I was training. To listen better." Hopkins smiled despite himself. "You weren't always blind," he said. "No," she replied simply. He waited, but she didn't elaborate. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing toward the low wall beside her. "You may," she said. "But I won't stop." "Good," he replied. She began again. Another piece. Another voice. Another life. Hopkins listened, truly listened, in a way he rarely had time for anymore. He noticed how she adjusted her breathing when the street grew louder. How she paused when a car passed, then resumed exactly where she'd left off. Control without force. When she finished, Hopkins spoke again. "You're very disciplined," he said. She smiled. "Blindness is an excellent teacher." He considered that. "You don't perform your own writing," he said. "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't want to be heard," she replied. "I want to be precise." Hopkins laughed softly. Those are not the same thing. No, she agreed. They rarely are. A silence settled between them. Not awkward. Earned. Do you perform often? He asked. When I'm allowed, she said. Allowed? She gestured vaguely. Permits. Complaints. People who think silence should only belong to them. He nodded. I know the type. She turned toward him slightly. You sound like someone who's been told to be louder. He smiled. More times than I can count. And did you? She asked. For a while, he said. It didn't last. She nodded. It never does. A car honked nearby. Someone shouted. The city continued. Hopkins reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. Then stopped. May I ask you something? He said. Yes. Do you need help? She didn't bristle. Didn't recoil. She considered the question seriously. No, she said. But I could use opportunity. He nodded slowly. What kind? He asked. The kind that doesn't announce itself, she replied. He smiled. Those are rare, he said. Yes, she agreed. Which is why they matter. He stood. I won't interrupt you again, he said. She smiled. You didn't interrupt. You listened. That's worse, he said lightly. She laughed softly. As he turned to leave, she spoke again. Anthony. He turned back. You said your name earlier, she said. Do you work with words? He hesitated. Yes, he said. Then, she added, thank you for writing ones that don't beg. Hopkins felt his throat tighten. You're welcome, he said quietly. He walked away slowly. Half a block later, he stopped. Something about the encounter unsettled him, not sentimentally, but structurally, as if a piece of his understanding had shifted. He turned around. She was still there, still performing, still unguarded. Hopkins took out his phone, and for the first time in years, he made a call without knowing exactly what he was going to say. What he did know, what settled firmly in his chest as he listened to her voice carry across the street, was this. He was not meant to walk away from that moment unchanged. And neither was she. What followed, how a chance encounter became an intervention, and why Hopkins would later describe it as one of the most necessary pauses of his life, had not yet revealed itself. But it had already begun. Anthony Hopkins didn't speak when the call connected. He listened. Can you get me a number? He finally said. No, don't ask why yet. Just trust me. There was a pause on the other end. Then a quiet, familiar reply. All right. Hopkins hung up and stood there longer than he meant to, watching Clara from across the street. She hadn't noticed he'd stopped. She was deep into another piece now, voice steady, posture unchanged, as if the world could rearrange itself around her without consequence. That unsettled him. Most people performed against the world. She performed within it. He crossed back over. Clara, he said gently. She stopped. Yes. I'm going to ask you something, he said. And you're allowed to say no. She smiled faintly. That's usually how questions work. He took a breath. There's a small theater, he said. Not far from here. Empty most nights. They host readings. Rehearsals. Things that don't sell tickets. She tilted her head. You're pitching something. I am, he admitted. I don't audition, she said calmly. I wouldn't ask you to, Hopkins replied. That made her pause. What are you asking then? I'm asking, he said, choosing his words carefully. If you'd consider performing somewhere quiet. Somewhere people come to listen, not pass by. She was silent for a long moment. Why? She asked. Hopkins didn't answer immediately. Because, he said finally, what you're doing out here deserves walls. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. Walls keep people out, she said. They also keep echoes in, Hopkins replied. She considered that. I don't want pity, she said. Neither do I, Hopkins said. Another pause. And I don't want to be introduced as anything, she added. Not blind. Not brave. Not inspirational. Hopkins nodded. You won't be. Then how? As a performer, he said. Nothing else. She exhaled slowly. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I ask, he replied. She resumed her performance. Hopkins didn't linger this time. The next week passed quietly. Too quietly. Hopkins found himself replaying the sound of her voice while reading scripts, while sitting through meetings, while walking familiar streets that now felt slightly misaligned. Something in him had been adjusted, subtly but permanently. 3 days later, his phone rang. Anthony, Clara's voice said. Yes. I found your theater, she said. I stood outside. And I didn't go in. Hopkins waited. I don't like rooms where people expect something, she said. He smiled gently. Neither do I. There was a pause. But, she continued, I liked the way it sounded when I tapped my cane on the steps. Hopkins closed his eyes. When, he asked. Tomorrow, she said. If you're serious. I am, he replied. The night of the performance, there were no posters. No announcements. No crowd. Just a few chairs. Dim lights. Silence waiting to be earned. Clara stood on stage alone, cane folded neatly at her side. Hopkins sat in the back, not because he wanted distance, but because he didn't want influence. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't explain. She began. Her voice filled the room differently than it had filled the street. Slower. Deeper. The silence held longer here. It worked harder. People leaned forward. Not because they were curious. Because they were listening. She performed pieces Hopkins recognized, and others he didn't. Words written by people long gone. Words borrowed. Words carried. When she finished, there was no immediate applause. Then one person clapped. Then another. Then the room joined. Not loud, not exuberant. Grateful. Afterward, Clara stood backstage, hands steady, breathing even. Hopkins approached her quietly. You were right, he said. About what? She asked. Walls, he replied. They do keep echoes in. She smiled. They also reveal them, she said. She didn't ask him for anything. He didn't offer money. Instead, he did something quieter. He made calls. Not announcements. Not favors. Introductions. Months passed. Clara performed more often. Not frequently, but intentionally. Small rooms. Attentive audiences. She never became famous. That was never the point. But something changed. People stopped seeing her blind as first. They heard her precision. One evening, after a performance, she found Hopkins sitting alone in the darkened theater. You changed my life, she said. Hopkins shook his head. No. You stopped, she insisted. He smiled faintly. So did you. She considered that. Why did you really stop that night? She asked. Hopkins thought for a long moment. Because, he said, I realized I'd spent years surrounded by people who needed to be heard, and I'd forgotten what listening sounded like. She nodded. Listening is dangerous. Yes, he agreed. It rearranges things. Years later, Hopkins would be asked in an interview about a turning point he never spoke about publicly. He'd smile and say, I once heard my own words spoken better than I ever said them. He wouldn't name her. He didn't need to. Because the truth wasn't about recognition. It was about interruption. About a blind woman on a street corner who wasn't asking to be saved, only to be heard. And a man who finally understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do when you hear something honest is stop and let it change everything.